My name is Troy Cole. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe with words like steady, reliable, and sometimes, if they're being honest, predictable. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I work in commercial risk assessment for a regional logistics firm. It's not glamorous work. I read contracts. I analyze exposure. I look for weaknesses before they cost someone millions of dollars. My job is to notice what other people overlook. Ironically, in my personal life, I was the one being overlooked. Most people see me as quiet, measured, the type who would rather listen than dominate a room. I don't raise my voice. I don't make dramatic exits. I don't perform strength for applause. And because of that, I've learned something uncomfortable. When a man doesn't demand attention, people often assume he doesn't have leverage. My wife believed that too. On our anniversary last year, she filed for divorce. She thought I wouldn't see it coming. She thought I would be blindsided. She thought I would beg, negotiate, apologize for things I didn't fully understand. She thought I would fight emotionally. Instead, I served her papers first. Before midnight, I made sure she knew the next step would cost her everything. Now, this isn't a story about revenge. There's no screaming match, no dramatic confrontation in a restaurant, no shattered plates or slammed doors. If you're looking for chaos, you won't find it here. This is a story about silence, about what happens when a man who has been underestimated for years decides not to explode, but to calculate. It's about how small dismissals become patterns, how patterns become roles, and how roles, if you accept them long enough, begin to define you, until one day they don't. I'm not proud of every thought I had during that season. I'm not here to paint myself as a hero. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I ignored signs I shouldn't have ignored. I told myself stories that kept me comfortable. But I never stopped observing. And once I stopped trying to save the marriage emotionally, I started protecting myself strategically. What unfolded over the following months wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. By the time she realized what was happening, it was already done. This story isn't about destroying someone. It's about understanding your value before someone else decides it for you. It's about restraint, about timing, about knowing that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits. If you've ever been the quiet one in the room, the one people assume won't push back, the one who absorbs more than he should, you might understand this better than you think. Have you ever noticed how differently people treat you once they believe you won't leave? For most of my marriage, I wasn't the main character in my own home. Not in an obvious way. There was no cruelty, no shouting, no public embarrassment. On the surface, we look stable, functional, the kind of couple people assume will make it. My wife, Danielle, was charismatic, quick-witted, social. She had a way of entering a room and subtly reorganizing its energy around herself. People leaned in when she spoke. They laughed at her stories. They sought her approval. I admired that about her in the beginning. Standing beside her, I became contrast. Where she was expressive, I was measured. Where she was emotional, I was steady. At least that's how we explained it to ourselves. But over time, that contrast shifted into something else. At dinner parties, when conversations turned to careers, Danielle would summarize my job before I could speak. "Oh, Troy just looks at contracts all day," she'd say lightly. "He's the boring, responsible one." Everyone would laugh, including me, because technically, it wasn't an insult, it was a joke. And jokes are harmless, right? Except they weren't isolated moments, they accumulated. When we discussed vacations, she chose the destination. When we discussed investments, she deferred to me publicly but rolled her eyes privately if I hesitated. When we disagreed about finances, she'd say, "You're overthinking it. You always overthink." Eventually, I started editing myself before speaking. It's subtle, that shift. You begin asking yourself, is this worth the friction? Is this worth being difficult? Is this worth disrupting the mood? So you let small things go. I handled the mortgage, the insurance, the retirement accounts. I tracked spending. I adjusted our portfolio quietly when markets shifted. I optimized our tax exposure every year without announcing it. Not because I wanted praise, but because that's how I show care. Still, in social settings, I became the background stability, the reliable structure no one notices unless it cracks. At family gatherings, her sister once joked, "Danielle married well, Troy's safe." Safe. Not strong, not decisive, not formidable. Safe. I remember the exact moment that word settled somewhere uncomfortable inside me. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. Safe meant predictable. Predictable meant controllable. Controllable meant unlikely to leave. And that assumption became the quiet foundation of everything that followed. To Danielle, I was the man who would always stay, the man who would always compromise first, the man who would absorb discomfort to maintain peace. And for years, she wasn't wrong, because I believed something flawed, that being steady meant being silent, that being loving meant being endlessly accommodating, that strength meant endurance. What I didn't understand yet was that endurance without boundaries doesn't create respect. It creates expectation, and expectations, once normalized, are rarely questioned. Looking back, I don't blame her entirely. People respond to the role you consistently play. If you show them you'll take the smaller portion, they'll stop offering you half. I played my role well. The calm one, the reasonable one, the one who doesn't escalate, the invisible backbone. What no one noticed, not even her, was that invisibility doesn't mean absence. It just means observation without interruption. And I was observing everything, every tone shift. Every dismissal is disguised as humor. Every assumption that I would remain exactly where I was placed. They thought I was comfortable in that position. They didn't realize I was taking notes. If I had to trace everything back to a single moment, the first real fracture, it wouldn't be dramatic. There was no shouting, no betrayal, no headline-worthy confession. It was something small. So small that if I described it to most people, they'd probably shrug. It happened about 18 months before our anniversary. We were at a dinner with two of her colleagues and their partners. A rooftop restaurant downtown, string lights, soft jazz playing somewhere behind us. The kind of place where people talk about vision and future growth. One of her coworkers, Marcus, was describing a real estate opportunity. A pre-construction development outside the city. High risk, high return. Everyone at the table seemed excited. Danielle turned to me and said, half smiling, "Troy will probably tell us it's too risky. He hates anything that isn't guaranteed." The table laughed. I smiled politely. Then Marcus asked, "What do you think, Troy?" I began explaining my concerns, construction delays, liquidity risk, zoning uncertainties, not dismissing it, just outlining variables. Danielle interrupted. "See, this is why I can't talk big ideas with him," she said playfully. "He lives in spreadsheets." The tone was light. The words were sharp. I stopped mid-sentence. Something in the air shifted, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I felt it. It wasn't that she disagreed with me. We disagreed before. It was the public framing. I wasn't a partner offering perspective. I was the cautious obstacle to excitement. And what bothered me most wasn't what she said. It was how easily it came out. Like she'd said versions of it in her head many times before. I let it go that night. On the drive home, I almost brought it up. The words sat in my throat. I rehearsed them silently. When you said I can't talk big ideas, but I swallowed them. Because technically, she hadn't insulted me. Technically, she was joking. Technically, I was being sensitive. That's how rationalization works. It's logical, clean, efficient. The problem is, it ignores pattern recognition. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing variations of that same tone. You wouldn't understand. It's more creative than analytical. You're great with numbers, not so much with people. You don't like change. Individually, they were harmless. Collectively, they formed a narrative. And narratives, repeated enough times, become identity. The strange part, no one else seemed bothered. Her friends saw it as banter. My friends saw it as normal marital teasing. I even tried to convince myself it was nothing. But something had shifted internally. I began watching instead of participating. Not withdrawing emotionally, just stepping back mentally. I noticed how often she corrected me in front of others. How often she made executive decisions and informed me afterward. How often my silence was interpreted as agreement. That rooftop dinner wasn't explosive. It was surgical. A precise, clean incision to something I hadn't realized was vulnerable. Respect. The first small cut isn't supposed to hurt much. It's supposed to be dismissible. And because you dismiss it, it becomes repeatable. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a quiet question. If she sees me as the safe, cautious background, what happens the day she wants something less safe? I didn't confront her. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't change behavior. But I did something subtle. I started documenting, not on paper, not yet, but mentally. Patterns, language, timing. Not because I planned retaliation, but because something inside me no longer trusted the narrative being built about me. And once you start noticing disrespect, even the polished, socially acceptable kind, You can't unsee it. After that dinner, nothing dramatic changed, which strangely made everything more dangerous. Because when there's no explosion, you tell yourself there's no fire. Life continued the way it always had. Work, gym, weekends with friends, family visits. On the surface, we were steady, functional, predictable. But something subtle had shifted inside me. Not anger, awareness. And awareness is quiet. Danielle didn't wake up one day and decide to diminish me. That's not how it works. It happened in increments. Casual comments, public reframing, small corrections delivered with a smile. The problem wasn't frequency at first. It was normalization. At a brunch with her parents, her father asked about our retirement timeline. Before I could answer, Danielle jumped in. "Oh, Dad, if it were up to Troy, we'd retire at 70 with 3 backup plans." Laughter around the table. I smiled again. It's strange how automatic that smile becomes, like a reflex designed to keep the peace. But I noticed something that morning. No one asked me to clarify. No one looked to me for the actual numbers. They accepted her framing. I was cautious, overly calculated, slightly rigid. Later that week, when we reviewed our joint savings account, she said, "You worry too much about worst-case scenarios. Not everything is a risk analysis." That phrase landed differently, because risk analysis is how I protect us. When she said it with mild irritation, it wasn't about finances. It was about identity. I started asking myself hard questions in silence. Was I rigid? Was I overly cautious? Or was I simply disciplined in a way that wasn't entertaining? There's a difference. But when someone repeats a narrative about you long enough, you start testing it against yourself. I replayed conversations in my head. I examined my tone, my body language, my timing, and I realized something uncomfortable. I had begun shrinking preemptively. If a discussion felt like it might create friction, I softened my position before she challenged it. If she dismissed an idea lightly, I abandoned it entirely. I told myself I was being mature, flexible, easygoing, but flexibility without mutual respect becomes self-erasure. Still, I rationalized it. She's just expressive. She doesn't mean it that way. She's stressed. That's how normalization works. You build explanations to protect the relationship. Because admitting a pattern means confronting it. And the confrontation felt disproportionate to the offense. There was no betrayal, no affair, no cruelty, just subtle positioning. Over time, I noticed how our dynamic played out socially. If I disagreed publicly, she'd correct me with humor. If she disagreed publicly, I'd defer and revisit it privately. If I raised a concern privately, she'd say I was overthinking. If she raised a concern, I took it seriously and adjusted. It wasn't malicious. It was asymmetrical. And asymmetry, left unchecked, becomes hierarchy. One evening, while she was out with friends, I sat alone in the living room, reviewing our investment allocations. The house was quiet, still. I looked around at everything I had structured. Mortgage refinanced at the right time. Emergency fund fully built. Insurance optimized. Retirement contributions maximized. Every layer of stability in that house had been engineered, quietly, without announcement, without applause. And I asked myself something that unsettled me. If I disappeared tomorrow, not emotionally but structurally, how long would it take before she felt it? That wasn't bitterness. It was curiosity, because I had started noticing something else. Danielle assumed permanence. She made long-term plans verbally that excluded negotiation. She committed us to events without asking. She invested socially as if our foundation were immovable. She didn't think I would ever disrupt the structure. And the more I stayed silent, the more that assumption hardened. That's the dangerous part about normalizing disrespect. It doesn't escalate quickly. It stabilizes. It becomes the air you breathe. You adapt to it. You function within it, until one day you realize you're not reacting anymore. You're observing, and observation, when sustained long enough, turns into calculation. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't planning anything yet, but I had stopped absorbing unconsciously. I had started measuring, and once you start measuring dynamics, instead of just experiencing them, you begin to see where leverage truly exists. There's a moment in every long relationship where you realize you've been cast in a role you never consciously auditioned for. For me, that realization didn't come during an argument. It came during a Sunday afternoon barbecue. We were in Danielle's friend circle, 6 couples, familiar rhythm, predictable conversations. I was standing near the grill with two of the husbands while Danielle animatedly told a story across the patio. One of the guys, Ben, nudged me and said, "Man, you've got it easy. Danielle runs the show. You just keep the ship steady." He meant it as a compliment. I nodded, but something in that phrasing stuck with me. Keeps the ship steady. Not captain, not navigator. Stability. Background infrastructure. Later that afternoon, Danielle asked me to grab more ice from the kitchen. On my way back, I overheard her say, "Troy doesn't really care where we live or what we do. He just wants things organized." That wasn't true. I cared deeply. I just didn't compete for airtime. And in a world that rewards volume, restraint gets translated as indifference. That evening, after everyone left, I replayed the day in my head. I realized something uncomfortable. I had become the man people assign tasks to. Reliable, capable, emotionally contained, but not consulted, not challenged, not fully seen. In subtle ways, Danielle had begun positioning herself as the visionary and me as the operator. She'd say things like, "I'm the dreamer, he's the realist." It sounded romantic, balanced, but the framing mattered. Dreamers lead, realists regulate. One sets direction, the other manages consequences. And over time, direction shapes perception. I began noticing how often she used collective language that masked unilateral decisions. We decided we're going to look at houses in the South End. Except I hadn't decided. I had reacted. We agreed this is the right time. Except I had expressed hesitation. The more I examined it, the clearer the structure became. Danielle thrived on expansion, socially, financially, emotionally. I specialized in containment, risk management, sustainability, longevity. Neither role is wrong, but an imbalance creates a distortion. I wasn't being oppressed. I was being categorized. And once you're categorized, people stop checking if it's accurate. The turning point wasn't anger. It was clarity. I realized I had been unconsciously reinforcing the role. Every time I stayed silent to keep the peace. Every time I deferred publicly to correct privately. Every time I minimized my preferences because they weren't urgent. I trained her to believe I had fewer boundaries than I actually did. And boundaries, when invisible, are assumed non-existent. That's the part no one talks about. You can't resent someone for stepping into a space you never defined. I had defined competence. I had defined stability. I had defined endurance. But I had never clearly defined limits. And without limits, reliability becomes exploitation, not intentional, but structural. That Sunday night, after she fell asleep, I walked downstairs and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt misrepresented. And there's a difference. Betrayal triggers emotion. Misrepresentation triggers recalibration. For the first time in years, I asked myself, if I stopped performing this role exactly as assigned, what would change? Would she panic? Would she adjust? Or would she simply assume I'd come back into position? That question stayed with me, because once you recognize you've been assigned a role, you have two choices: continue playing it, or quietly prepare to redefine it. And I had just begun to consider the second option. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It didn't happen during a betrayal. It happened on a Tuesday, ordinary, quiet, almost forgettable, which is why it mattered. I had come home early from work that day. A client meeting had been rescheduled, and for once, my calendar had space. The house was still. Late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, cutting long horizontal lines across the living room floor. Danielle was at the kitchen island with her laptop open. She didn't hear me come in. She was on a video call. At first, I wasn't paying attention. I set my keys down quietly and poured a glass of water. But then I heard my name. "I love him," she was saying, laughing lightly. "Troy's solid. He's just safe, predictable. I don't think he'd ever actually leave. Even if he was unhappy, he'd stay." There was a pause. Then she added, "He doesn't like conflict. That's the thing. He avoids it. So I never really worry." She said it casually, confidently, like she was describing gravity. I stood there, motionless, just out of her line of sight. Not angry, not devastated, just still. It wasn't the safe comment that hit me this time. It was the certainty. She didn't say, "I hope he'd stay." She didn't say, "I think he'd work through it." She said she never worried, because I wouldn't leave, because I avoided conflict, because my endurance had been misread as a limitation. I walked upstairs, without interrupting the call, sat on the edge of our bed, and for the first time in years, I allowed a thought I had previously rejected. What if I did leave? Not impulsively, not emotionally, strategically. What would that look like? I wasn't fantasizing about freedom. I was running a scenario analysis. Assets, liabilities, exposure, legal posture. I knew our finances intimately. I knew where we were strong, where we were vulnerable. But until that moment, I had never run the scenario of exit, because leaving felt like failure. Leaving felt reactive. Leaving felt like something emotional people do when they can't regulate. But what if leaving could be controlled? Deliberate? What if it wasn't about escaping her, but about reclaiming definition? Downstairs, I could hear her laughing again on the call. Comfortable. Secure in an assumption. That security changed something in me. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I realized something undeniable. She wasn't protecting the marriage anymore. She was relying on my tolerance to protect it. And tolerance has a threshold. I went into my home office and opened my laptop. Not to file anything. Not to search for lawyers. Just to review. Joint accounts, investment portfolios, property deed structures, beneficiary designations. I didn't touch anything. I simply observed, the same way I observe risk exposures at work. Detached, analytical. It wasn't about anger. It was about information, and information is stabilizing. When Danielle came upstairs later that evening, she kissed my cheek like always, asked about my day, complained lightly about hers. Nothing had changed for her. But internally, something irreversible had happened for me. I had stopped assuming permanence. That's the moment the power dynamic shifts quietly. Not when you confront, not when you threaten, but when you emotionally detach from inevitability. For the first time, I realized I had options, and I wasn't afraid of them. That Tuesday wasn't explosive. It was clarifying. I went to sleep that night differently. Not distant, not cold, just awake. And once you're awake to the fact that someone believes you'll never disrupt their comfort, you begin to wonder what would happen if you did. After that Tuesday, I didn't change my behavior in any way she could detect. I still woke up early, still made coffee, still reviewed our monthly budget on the first of every month, still asked about her day. But internally, my silence was no longer passive. It was intentional. There's a difference. Before, I stayed quiet to maintain harmony. Now, I stayed quiet to gather clarity. Danielle mistook the continuity for stability. If anything, she seemed more relaxed, more certain of the terrain. She began making long-term assumptions out loud. We'll probably upgrade the house in 2 years. We should start planning a bigger anniversary trip next summer. Maybe we'll look into investment properties once your bonus comes in. She spoke as if our trajectory was fixed, as if I were an unmovable component. And I let her speak, because the more confident someone is in an assumption, the less they monitor it. I began shifting small things, subtle, administrative adjustments that meant nothing emotionally, but everything structurally. I reviewed our joint credit exposure. I restructured how certain automatic deposits were categorized. Still transparent, still legal, but optimized differently. I began keeping printed copies of documents I had previously only stored digitally. No secrecy, just redundancy. At work, I often advise clients that risk isn't about what you expect to happen. It's about what you're prepared for, if it does. For years, I had prepared our marriage for growth. Now, I was preparing myself for independence. What surprised me most was the calm. There was no adrenaline, no late-night panic, no dramatic internal monologue, just precision. Danielle continued her subtle pattern of dismissal, though she probably didn't even recognize it as such. One night at dinner with friends, she joked, Troy would build a bunker before he'd buy a vacation home. Everyone laughed again. This time, I didn't smile. I simply took a sip of water and said nothing. The silence lingered slightly longer than usual. Not awkward, just noticeable. She glanced at me briefly, almost confused, as if she expected reinforcement. That was the first external sign something had shifted. When you stop performing your assigned role, people feel the absence, even if they can't name it. At home, she asked, "Are you okay lately? You seem quiet." I almost laughed at that. Quiet. I had always been quiet, but now my quiet had edges. "I'm fine," I said evenly. And I was, because silence had become strategic. I stopped volunteering emotional reassurance, not to punish, but to observe the response. Would she lean in? Would she recalibrate? Or would she assume I'd regulate myself back into comfort? Mostly, she carried on, which told me something important. Her sense of security wasn't rooted in mutual effort. It was rooted in predictability. And predictability, when over-relied upon, becomes blindness. Around that time, I scheduled a consultation. Not to file anything, just to understand. A private meeting with a family law attorney during a lunch break. I asked questions. Asset division, state statutes, timelines, exposure points. I didn't give details. I didn't accuse. I simply gathered information. When I walked back to my office afterward, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear. Control. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Back at home, Danielle was planning a small anniversary dinner for us. She mentioned it casually one evening. Nothing big, she said. Just something nice. Yes, guys, we deserve it. I nodded, and inside, I marked the date. Because by then, I had already begun considering something she never anticipated. She believed I avoided conflict. What she didn't understand was this. Avoiding noise is not the same as avoiding action, and the quietest decisions are often the most irreversible. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. Danielle never questioned my time with spreadsheets. She never monitored my calendar closely. My work was technical, dense, and uninteresting to anyone who didn't live inside it, which meant I could operate in plain sight without triggering suspicion. The first thing I did was shift from mental notes to documented ones. Not emotional journaling, documentation, dates, statements, property records, screenshots of account balances at specific intervals. Not because I expected a fight, but because clarity removes vulnerability. At work, I often tell clients, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. I applied that principle to my own life. I created a separate encrypted archive, legal, ethical, clean, copies of mortgage agreements, insurance beneficiaries, investment allocations, tax filings from the last 5 years. Nothing hidden, just organized. The second step was education. Even though I understood finance deeply, family law is its own ecosystem. I read statutes relevant to North Carolina, asset classification rules, marital versus separate property distinctions, timeline mechanics. I didn't rush. I studied. Quietly. I also began observing Danielle differently, not emotionally, but behaviorally. Spending patterns, verbal commitments she made without consulting me, the way she framed our finances socially versus privately. There was a gap. Publicly, she implied fluid abundance. Privately, she deferred to my caution. That contradiction told me something important. She trusted the safety net, even while minimizing it. Around that time, I opened a separate account. Transparent, legal, funded with bonuses that were technically mine under our existing structure. I didn't drain anything. I didn't hide transfers. I simply stopped over-contributing beyond what was structurally required. It wasn't aggression. It was boundary recalibration. The house remained calm. We still had dinner together. We still watched shows on the couch. But internally, I was building independence layer by layer. I also began meeting with my attorney more regularly. No filing yet, just scenario mapping. If she files first, I asked during one meeting, what shifts? The attorney answered calmly, outlining procedural advantages, service timing, and documentation weight. I listened, not because I wanted to win, but because I refused to be reactive. At home, Danielle never sensed preparation. Why would she? I hadn't changed emotionally. I hadn't withdrawn affection. If anything, I was more centered than I'd been in years. There's something stabilizing about knowing you have options. One evening, she said casually, I don't know what I'd do without you managing all this stuff. She gestured vaguely toward the office. It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging my structural role. I looked at her and thought, you might find out. But I didn't say that. Instead, I asked, do you ever think about how we'd handle things if we weren't together? She laughed. Why would we not be together? There it was again. Certainty. Absolute unexamined certainty. I nodded slowly and let the conversation drop. That was the moment I understood something clearly. She wasn't malicious. She was comfortable. And comfort makes people careless. By the time our anniversary approached, I had assembled something invisible but powerful. Knowledge, documentation, legal clarity, financial insulation, and most importantly, emotional detachment from inevitability. I wasn't preparing to hurt her. I was preparing to stop being assumed. She never noticed the shift. She never noticed the redundancy in paperwork, the quiet consultations, the incremental restructuring, because preparation, when done correctly, doesn't disrupt the present. It safeguards the future. And by then, I was no longer asking whether I would act. I was deciding when. The discovery wasn't explosive. It didn't come with raised voices or locked phones or dramatic late-night confrontations. It came through a document review. 2 weeks before our anniversary, I was reconciling our quarterly investment summaries. Danielle had recently shown interest in diversifying into a private equity vehicle through a friend of hers. She'd mentioned it casually, said it was just exploratory. I had asked for the details. She forwarded the proposal. That's when I noticed something unusual. There was a secondary advisory agreement attached, one that included a clause about individual liability exposure, not joint, individual. Danielle had signed an intent letter, alone. It wasn't finalized, but it was binding enough to create financial implications if executed. The amount wasn't catastrophic, but the structure was reckless. And the most important part, she hadn't told me, not because she was hiding an affair, not because she was plotting something sinister, but because she didn't think it required discussion. That was the real revelation. She believed she could move independently when it was exciting, and rely on me when it required stabilization. Expansion without consultation. Containment without acknowledgement. I printed the documents and placed them in my black leather portfolio, not as evidence for confrontation, as confirmation. Later that week, during a quiet dinner at home, I asked gently, "What's the timeline on that private equity thing?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, it's nothing serious yet, just networking." I watched her carefully. Her tone wasn't deceptive, it was minimizing. She didn't perceive risk, because risk had always been my department. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in my office and ran projections. Worst-case exposure scenarios, liquidity implications if the investment underperforms, legal complications if separation occurred during the lock-in period. And that's when clarity crystallized. If she filed first, especially around an emotionally charged date like our anniversary, she could frame the narrative. Emotional abandonment, sudden distance, unforeseen dissatisfaction. But if I filed first, the posture shifted. It became strategic timing, controlled service, documented financial awareness, and most importantly, protection from unilateral risk decisions. I wasn't celebrating. There was no surge of triumph, just stillness, because I finally understood the leverage. Do not leverage her emotionally. Leverage over the structure. If she believed I would always stay, then filing first wasn't retaliation. It was a recalibration. I scheduled one final meeting with my attorney. We reviewed everything. Assets, the unsigned but risky investment agreement, timeline advantages, service mechanics. He looked at me and asked, "Are you certain?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about our early years, the laughter, the alignment, the hope. Then I thought about the rooftop dinner, the certainty in her voice on that Tuesday call. The investment intent letter was signed without consultation, and I realized something profound. She wasn't planning to leave. She just believed she could move without consequence. And that imbalance would only widen. "Yes," I said finally. "File it." The papers were prepared discreetly, legally sound, procedurally clean. The date of service, our anniversary, not for drama, for clarity, because symbolism matters. And before midnight that day, I intended to ensure she understood something she had never considered. Safe doesn't mean stationary. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. And predictability can expire. The week before our anniversary felt strangely normal. Danielle was excited about the dinner reservation. She'd chosen a place downtown, intimate, candlelit, the kind of restaurant that markets itself as timeless. She mentioned it twice, almost proudly, like she was curating a narrative. 8 years, she said one evening, smiling. That's solid. Solid. I almost commented on the irony. Instead, I nodded. By that point, the papers were already drafted, reviewed, adjusted, sitting inside my leather portfolio in my office drawer. I hadn't signed yet. That was the final threshold. There's a difference between preparation and action. Preparation is hypothetical. Action is irreversible. For several nights, I sat alone in my office after she went to bed, staring at the documents. Petitioner, Troy Alexander Cole. Grounds, irretrievable breakdown. Clean, neutral, emotionless language. I ran through alternatives. Option 1, confront her directly about the patterns. Attempt counseling, expose the asymmetry explicitly, and see if recalibration is possible. Option 2, wait, monitor further, maintain leverage quietly, but don't act yet. Option 3, file first, establish structural control, shift the balance definitively. The first option required vulnerability without a guarantee. The second prolonged ambiguity. The third created clarity. I asked myself a hard question. If nothing changes, where will we be in 5 years? The answer came easily. More unilateral decisions, more casual minimization, more certainty that I would absorb the consequences. Not because she was cruel, but because I had allowed the pattern to solidify. I wasn't filing because she signed an investment letter. I wasn't filing because of a single joke at a rooftop dinner. I was filing because I had finally accepted something fundamental. Respect cannot be negotiated from a position of assumed permanence. And she assumed I was permanent. On the morning of our anniversary, I woke at sunrise. The house was silent. The air felt still, in a way I can't fully describe. I went downstairs, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the documents in front of me. My hand didn't shake when I signed. That surprised me. No dramatic hesitation, no surge of anger, just steady handwriting. I placed the papers back into the portfolio and closed it gently. Danielle came downstairs an hour later, cheerful, wrapped in a robe. "Happy anniversary," she said, kissing my cheek. "Happy anniversary," I replied. And I meant it, because anniversaries are markers. They don't just celebrate what exists. They measure what's endured. Throughout the day, we exchanged polite texts. She mentioned the dinner again, confirmed the time. At 3 p.m., I stepped out of the office and met the process server, a block away from our house. I handed over the envelope, calmly, legally, without spectacle. The plan was simple. She would be served at home before dinner, before the reservation, before the curated celebration, and before midnight, I would make sure she understood something clearly. The next step, whatever she chose, would have financial consequences she hadn't modeled, not threats, facts. As I walked back toward the house, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. For the first time in years, my external action matched my internal awareness. This wasn't revenge. It was a correction. The decision had been made. And once a man like me decides, he doesn't revisit it emotionally. He follows through. The timing wasn't theatrical. It was precise. At 4:12 p.m., while I was still at my office, the process server rang our doorbell. Danielle texted me first. "There's a man here asking for you. Says it's legal paperwork." I didn't respond immediately. Not out of cruelty. Out of composure. 30 seconds later, another message came through. "Troy, what is this?" I could picture her standing in the entryway, envelope in hand, confusion turning into realization as she read the first page. Petitioner, Troy Alexander Cole. Her assumption, permanence, had just fractured. I waited 5 full minutes before replying. "We'll talk tonight." No accusation, no explanation, just inevitability. When I drove home, the house felt different, not chaotic, not loud, just altered, as if the air pressure had shifted. Danielle was sitting at the kitchen island, the papers spread neatly in front of her, not crumpled, not thrown, organized. That told me something about her too. "You filed?" she asked quietly. "Yes." There was no screaming, no dramatic disbelief, just stunned recalibration. "I was going to talk to you," she said after a moment. This isn't." She stopped mid-sentence. Because what was she going to say? That she was unhappy? That she felt unseen? That she had considered leaving? Maybe she had, but she never thought she would be the one reacting. "I know," I said calmly. "That's why I filed." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in confusion. "That doesn't make sense." "It does," I replied evenly. "You just haven't looked at it from my side." Silence settled between us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't mention the rooftop dinner, the Tuesday call, the investment letter. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about repositioning the structure. She flipped through the pages slowly. "You've already spoken to a lawyer?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough." That answer unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant this wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was measured. She stood up and walked toward the living room, pacing once before turning back to me. "Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy?" "I wasn't unhappy," I said truthfully. "I was aware." That landed harder than anger would have. She tried a different angle. "Is this about the investment thing?" I was going to bring it up again. "It's about pattern," I said quietly, "and structure." She looked at me like she was seeing a version of me she hadn't cataloged before. Not louder, not colder, just immovable. That's when I said the sentence that shifted the room. "Before midnight, I need you to understand something clearly. The next step you choose will cost you more than you think." Her face tightened. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm informing you." I walked to my office and returned with a folder. Inside were printed projections. If she proceeded with the private equity investment during the separation, if she attempted unilateral asset movement, if she contested aggressively. Not intimidation. Mathematics. You've built your lifestyle assuming I'll stabilize it, I continued evenly. That assumption is no longer operational. She stared at the documents, not because she doubted them, because she had never imagined needing to understand them. For the first time in our marriage, she wasn't ahead of the narrative. She was reacting to it, and I remained calm. No shouting, no blame, just clarity. That evening, we didn't go to the anniversary dinner. The reservation remained unused. Instead, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the structure of 8 years quietly dissolving, not in chaos, but in comprehension. She had believed I would never disrupt comfort. Now she was learning the cost of that belief. And I wasn't angry. I was finished being assumed. The first consequence wasn't legal. It was psychological. The morning after our anniversary, Danielle woke up earlier than usual. I could hear her moving around downstairs before my alarm went off. Drawers opening. Cabinet doors are closing more carefully than normal. When I came into the kitchen, she was already seated at the island, laptop open, the divorce papers beside her. She looked tired, not from crying, from thinking. "Can we talk about the timeline?" she asked quietly. That was new, not denial, not outrage. Logistics. Yes, I said calmly, taking my usual seat, and we discussed it. Temporary living arrangements, financial disclosures, asset inventory requirements. I answered her questions without emotion, without sarcasm. The more neutral I remained, the more unsettled she became, because she expected defensiveness, or regret, or second-guessing. Instead, she got structure. Over the next few days, small cracks began forming in her social circle. She told a few close friends what happened. I didn't control the narrative. I didn't send explanations. I simply let facts exist. One of her friends texted me directly. "Is this real? I thought you two were solid." I replied with a single line. "We were structured, not aligned." No drama, no character assassination. Meanwhile, Danielle began to realize something she had never fully appreciated. She didn't know the mechanics of our financial life. She knew we were stable. She didn't know how stability was constructed. When she asked about certain accounts, why transfers had slowed slightly months earlier, I explained plainly. I optimized contributions under my compensation structure. It's legal. It's documented. She nodded, but I could see it registering. She had assumed fluidity. Instead, she found architecture. One afternoon, she asked, "Did you plan this around the anniversary to hurt me?" I paused before answering. "No," I said truthfully. "I planned it around the anniversary because it's when you were least expecting accountability." She didn't respond, but she absorbed it. That's when the emotional layer began shifting. Not rage, not grief. Recognition. At work, I maintained my routine. No one knew. I didn't broadcast it. The quiet discipline that had defined me professionally now defined me personally. Danielle, on the other hand, began showing subtle signs of destabilization. She postponed the private equity investment formally, citing personal matters. She stopped making long-term social commitments. She asked more questions than she ever had before. Questions about structure, about risk, about what separation would actually mean. The lifestyle she assumed would remain intact suddenly required negotiation. And negotiation is uncomfortable when you've never had to initiate it. The most telling moment came one evening when she said softly, "I didn't think you would actually do something like this." I looked at her evenly. I know, that wasn't cruelty. It was a fact. The consequence wasn't the loss of money yet. It wasn't court dates or asset division. It was the collapse of certainty. She had built emotional security on the belief that I avoided disruption. Now, she was confronting something she had never modeled. A quiet man who moves without announcing. And the hardest part for her wasn't the divorce itself. It was realizing she had underestimated the one person stabilizing her world. Not because I was loud, but because I was precise. And precision, once activated, doesn't waver. About 3 weeks after the papers were served, something shifted in Danielle. Up until then, she had operated in analysis mode, questions, timelines, logistics, meetings with her own attorney, measured, composed. But reality has a delayed effect. It sets in gradually. The first visible crack appeared on a Thursday evening. She came home later than usual, set her bag down slowly, and stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, like she was trying to remember why she walked in there. I was reviewing emails at the table. She looked at me and said quietly, I don't think I understood how this would feel. I closed my laptop. How does it feel? I asked. Unstable, she admitted. That word mattered, because instability had always been what I protected her from. The house was still ours, for now. The finances were still intact, for now. But the certainty, that was gone. She had met with her attorney that afternoon. She'd learned what separation actually meant in numbers. Asset division realities. Liquidity constraints. The practical slowdown of everything she once assumed would accelerate. I thought, she paused, I thought if we ever had problems, we'd just fix them. We could have, I said calmly. She looked at me sharply. Then why didn't you talk to me? There it was. The question arrives too late. I did, I answered, just not loudly. She frowned slightly. When? Every time I deferred publicly and corrected privately. Every time I expressed hesitation, you reframed it as fear. Every time you assumed I wouldn't leave. Silence stretched between us. Not hostile. Heavy. I didn't think you were that unhappy, she said finally. I wasn't, I replied. I was becoming irrelevant. That landed harder than an accusation would have, because it wasn't about emotional drama. It was about erosion. Over the next few days, she began making subtle attempts at repair. Longer conversations at dinner, more attentive listening, questions about my work she had never asked before. It wasn't manipulation. It was awareness. But awareness after structural action is different than awareness before it. When you file, you don't just signal dissatisfaction. You signal the conclusion. One night, she sat across from me and said, "If I asked you to stop this, would you?" The question was soft, not demanding, not entitled, just vulnerable. I considered it honestly. Stopping now wouldn't restore what changed, I said carefully. It would pause the paperwork, not the pattern. She looked down at the table. I didn't realize you felt that unseen. I know. There it was again. Not anger, not blame, just truth. The hardest part for her wasn't losing me. It was realizing she had misunderstood me. She had categorized me as conflict avoidant. But what I actually avoid is chaos, not consequence. By the time she fully grasped that distinction, the legal process was already in motion. Deadlines had been triggered, disclosures initiated, positions established. Irreversible doesn't mean immediate. It means committed. And commitment, once made quietly, doesn't reverse because emotion spikes. That week, she stopped arguing entirely. Stopped analyzing hypotheticals. Stopped trying to regain narrative control. Instead, she grew quiet. For the first time in our marriage, she looked uncertain. And I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just clarity. Because this wasn't about watching her panic. It was about knowing I had finally respected myself enough to act before resentment turned into something uglier. By the time she wanted to fix it, it wasn't anger she was facing. It was finality. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in our living room on a Sunday afternoon. No raised voices, no audience, just two chairs facing each other and 8 years sitting quietly between us. Danielle had spent the weekend at her sister's house. When she returned, there was a different energy about her. Not frantic, not defensive. Resolved. "Can we talk without lawyers in the room?" she asked. "We are," I replied evenly. She sat down across from me, hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time since the filing, she wasn't trying to analyze logistics. She was trying to understand. "I need to know something," she said carefully. "Did you ever plan to tell me before filing?" I considered the question honestly. "I planned to protect myself," I said. "And I knew if I told you too early, you'd try to stabilize emotionally, not structurally." Her eyes flickered. "That's not fair." "It's accurate," I replied calmly. She exhaled slowly. "You think I would have just convinced you to stay? I think you would have assumed I still would." Silence. That was the difference between us in that moment. She had believed love equaled permanence. I had learned permanence without respect erodes love. "I never meant to make you feel small," she said finally. "I know." That wasn't sarcasm. I genuinely believed her. Intent and impact are rarely identical. She leaned back slightly, studying me, like she was seeing a new outline of someone she thought she knew. "You're not angry," she observed. "No." "You're not trying to hurt me." "No." "Then why does this feel like punishment?" I paused before answering. "Because consequences feel personal when you didn't anticipate them." Her jaw tightened slightly. "That sounds like something you'd say at work." "It applies here." She gave a small, almost defeated smile. For years, she had teased me for living in spreadsheets. Now she was confronting the reality that I lived in systems. And this divorce, was a system I had activated intentionally. I underestimated you, she said quietly. That was the first time she named it. Yes, I replied. No triumph, no sharpness, just acknowledgement. She looked down at her hands. I thought being steady meant you'd always bend first. Being steady means I bend strategically, I corrected gently, not endlessly. That was the moment something shifted in her expression. Not fear, recognition. The man she thought avoided conflict had simply chosen a form of confrontation she couldn't overpower. Calm, prepared, unshakable. I don't hate you, she said softly. I don't hate you either. That was true. There was no bitterness in me, only clarity. I wish you'd forced me to see it earlier, she admitted. I shouldn't have to force someone to see me, I answered quietly. The room went still again. No shouting, no tears, just truth settling into its final shape. That conversation lasted less than an hour. No dramatic closing line, no cinematic exit. When she stood to go upstairs, she paused at the base of the staircase. You're different, she said. No, I replied. I just stopped being assumed. And that was the final confrontation. Not explosive, not heated, just decisive. The divorce wasn't chaotic. It wasn't drawn out into a public spectacle. It concluded the same way it began, quietly, procedurally, without unnecessary destruction. Assets were divided according to the law. The house was sold. Accounts were untangled with clinical precision. There were no emergency motions, no last-minute accusations. Just documentation, signatures, and a steady unwinding of what had once been shared. A year has passed since the anniversary that changed everything. I live in a smaller place now, not downgraded, refined, intentional, minimal, in a way that feels clean rather than reduced. People sometimes ask if I regret it. I don't. But that doesn't mean I celebrate it either. There's a difference between relief and victory. I didn't win anything. I corrected something. The most significant change isn't external, it's internal calibration. I speak earlier now, not louder. Earlier. If something feels misaligned, I don't store it in mental archives for years. I don't rationalize dismissals as personality quirks. I don't confuse endurance with strength. I also don't overcompensate. That was important. After the divorce, there was a brief period where I almost swung too far, hyper-independent, overly guarded. But I recognized that impulse quickly. Protection doesn't require isolation. Boundaries don't require coldness. What I've learned is this. Quiet dominance isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your threshold. For most of my marriage, my threshold for discomfort was too high. I could absorb more than I should have, so I did. Now, my threshold is defined. If someone jokes at my expense publicly, I address it calmly in the moment. If a decision affects me, I participate before it's finalized. If I sense asymmetry forming, I correct it before it stabilizes. Not aggressively, simply clearly. Danielle and I don't speak often now. When we do, it's respectful, structured. There's no animosity between us. In some strange way, the divorce forced us into our most honest dynamic. She once told me, months after everything settled, I see you differently now. I believe her. But that version of me didn't emerge from anger. It emerged from refusal. Refusal to remain underestimated. Refusal to remain structurally silent. Refusal to let permanence replace participation. The leather portfolio still sits on my desk. Not because I'm planning anything, but because it reminds me of something essential. Preparation isn't paranoia. It's self-respect. I don't walk through life assuming betrayal. I walk through it assuming responsibility for myself. And there's a calm that comes with that. Not defensive, not guarded, just aligned. If I ever marry again, it won't be from a place of needing to be seen. It will be from a place of already being clear. Because I am not the safe, predictable man people once categorized. I am steady. And steady doesn't mean stationary. It means deliberate. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that silence isn't weakness. But it can become it if you never define what your silence means. For years, I thought love was endurance. I thought maturity was absorbing discomfort quietly. I thought strength was staying no matter what. What I understand now is simpler. Love requires participation. Respect requires visibility. And permanence requires mutual awareness, not assumption. Danielle didn't wake up one day and decide to disregard me. She adapted to the version of me I consistently presented. Capable, calm, endlessly accommodating. I helped build the imbalance by refusing to correct it early. That's the part most people don't like admitting. It's easier to blame someone else's behavior than to examine your own boundaries. But boundaries delayed are boundaries denied. And when you finally enforce them after years of silence, it feels sudden to the other person, even if it's been forming quietly for a long time. I don't hate her. I don't see her as a villain. She miscalculated my threshold, and I miscalculated how long I should tolerate misrepresentation. That's all. Before midnight on our anniversary, I made sure she understood that the next step would cost her everything, not because I wanted to destroy her, but because I wanted to stop being assumed. There's a difference between punishing someone and correcting a dynamic. One is emotional, the other is structural. Quiet dominance isn't about intimidation. It's about alignment. It's about knowing that you don't need to shout to shift the balance. You just need to move. And once you move with clarity, without rage, without spectacle, the message lands deeper than any argument ever could. If you've been the quiet one in your relationship, if you've been the reliable one, the steady one, the one people assume will always stay, ask yourself something honestly. Are you choosing silence, or are you afraid to disrupt comfort? I'm curious what you think. At what point does endurance stop being strength and start becoming self-erasure? Let me know in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.